Good evening, guys. My name is Hardis. Welcome to our first podcast for Gorilla. Jake, thanks a lot for joining us on the first Gorilla podcast. It's a pleasure to host you here tonight.
Thanks for having me.
I guess the first obvious question is to ask you a bit about yourself. I've always had this question that I wanted to ask you. I know it's a bit of a formal setting now to ask you this question, but how does someone get involved in MMA in this day and age? And I guess it sounds like a cliche question, but you're obviously 28 years old. You're a professional MMA fighter. You're part of the UFC. I guess my question is that, 10, 11, 12 years ago, UFC wasn't really a thing. It wasn't something that you really heard about. It wasn't something that was really marketed. And I guess you as a pup coming up, I mean, what do you want to be? Like when you first entered the martial arts gym, you're like, I want to be a part of this UFC. Or did you even know what UFC was? Or was it around? How did you kind of get involved? Does it make sense what I'm trying to get across?
Yeah. Like I said, it's a cliche question, but it's a very cliche story. I was a young Aussie kid playing Aussie rules football, played for 9 years, played at high representative level, even did a stint with the TAC Cup for a year. And that was pretty much my life. I also did boxing for football, specifically for fitness. So that was my first introduction to some sort of martial art or fighting. Never had a boxing fight, but I was very good at boxing. And then my dad he used to train back in the early 90s. He's a Taekwondo champion, did a bit of jiu-jitsu, actually took part in the first ever seminar with Carlos Gracie Jr. in Australia. Got his photo at home with Carlos Gracie Jr. And so he always introduced us to martial arts and everything from Filipino stick fighting to grappling to boxing. And when the footy got serious, I wanted a means to stay fit during the off season. So I didn't want to sit at home and go play with my mates. I wanted to start, taking it seriously. And I had a few friends that did kickboxing. So I went along to the kickboxing gym, joined in. And then, they had jiu-jitsu. My old man used to do jiu-jitsu. I'll jump in, do jiu-jitsu, and that progressed to MMA. So I trained for about 3 months. And at that point, I still wanted to be an AFL player. I wanted to play for Hawthorn. You have to forgive me. Just slowly progressed. And then the coach asked me, after about 3 months of training, he said, I've just been asked if someone was to jump in for a last minute fight. I think it was Tuesday or Wednesday, and the fight was on Friday. So it was a 2 or 3 day notice. And I just typical Aussie kid, I'll jump in, have a punch on, see how we go. No expectations, not a care in the world. Still wanted to play football, so I wasn't worried about a UFC career at all. And we got to the event and we heard this sound, like bang, 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 and we look out in the hallway and it's my opponent. He's like a 24-year-old, I'm 15, 24-year-old, and he's kicking the pads like a monster.
It's like that kickboxer scene,
when he's kicking the pole. It was like that. Pole. And my old man looks at me and he goes, maybe we should just pull a pin on it. You know what I mean? And I said, no, I'll jump in and fight him. And the way the fight went is probably the reason why I decided that I wanted to do this for a career. Because the first round was stand-up, wrestling, takedowns, bit of submission attempts. And then the second round, I walked out. And then the video, it looks like it's the first round. It's a cool video because it looks like the first round. And the bell goes and he walks out and he's got his hands down like this, a bit cocky. And I just sort of play with my hands and I just throw up the first head kick I've ever thrown in my life. Don't know where it came from. I got the flexibility of a cricket bat. I threw up his left head kick and just hit him clean, just knocked him out cold. And that was it. And I was hooked. I remember we're in the car on the way home, we're eating Zinger burgers. And I said to my dad, I think I want to do this for the rest of my life. And my dad said, it's going to be hard work, but whether or not my family sort of believed that's something I could do, they supported me from the start. And they said, if something you want to do, it's going to be hard work. And that was it. And then it was just, gave the footy up that season and just committed to training every day from the age of 15, 16. And then it went from amateur career, very successful amateur career, 10 wins, 10 fights, 10 wins. I had a pro fight before I was 18. I actually got in big trouble for it because we sort of weren't supposed to fight before I was 18, but I had a pro fight before I was 18 and then had to wait till I was 18, went pro, went 7-0, got into the Ultimate Fighter. And then from there, made the connection with the UFC, and the rest is history.
So I guess that's a bit of, it's a bit about how you got into the fighting kind of thing. I guess see how with AFL, You know, you play in the EDFL, for example, right? A grade.
Yep.
You know, you play for West Meadows, and then, you know, you start from under 10s, and then you work your way up. Then you play for resis, then you get seniors, or then you get part of, like you said, the TAC.
Yes. Yeah.
So there's a kind of like a step-by-step structure to how you kind of get to VFL or AFL. I guess for me, what I've always been curious about with UFC is, what's the draft process to getting to the UFC? You know, all these fighters were coming up that I was hearing about, local fighters, you know, and obviously, like, the sport in the general sense wasn't as well known as what it is today. Like today, it's like you speak to a lot of the boys. What are you doing? I'm gonna watch UFC on Sunday. I'm just gonna, you know,
very common now.
Just gonna chill out and watch the main event on all the other fights. So I guess you as a 15-year-old, which was what, 13 years ago. So you're talking 2010, 2011. Did you know about the UFC at that point? Did you know that organization existed? And then how was it that, like, okay, I went from, you know, I'm gonna drop punt on Sundays, right? Kicking a footy, kicking a sharing around, to, no, I'm gonna go armbar this guy and until he taps out. And then how'd you find out about the UFC?
I started training first, which I think is probably, most people obviously would know what the UFC is now before they start training. So I started training first.
Okay.
I went to the gym first, and then I remember it was my birthday, or my dad just got me a gift. It was best of 2008 knockouts. And that was really my first time watching the UFC before. I saw some really, really old footage from like the early 90s. But apart from that, I didn't really follow it. It was actually going to the gym in the first place, starting to train, is what got me into the UFC. And then, you know, like back then you'd go to the Blockbuster and you'd still rent the DVDs. And so we'd go and watch all the UFC highlights. And didn't know how we would even get in the UFC, anything about the drafting process. We knew the Ultimate Fighter existed, which is obviously a good platform to get to the UFC. So our goal was just get in, win fights, and they'll either reach out or we'll wait for a tryout to come to Australia. And that's what happened. So, but these days, there's a few things that can contribute to getting the UFC. Your pedigree might even be in other sports. So you might be a high level athlete in another combat sport, and you're really well known. That could get you to the UFC. Just being successful, winning fights, Ultimate Fighter, the Dana White Contender Series now. Or, which annoys me, but how many social media followers you have can actually, I'm not even joking. Like, we've seen fighters get in before just because they're a big influencer and they've got a big following on social media. And that does help, because you're bringing another audience to the UFC. And it's, at the end of the day, it is business, so you can understand that. But I always think the results should speak for themselves and the performance should speak. But again, it is business at the end of the day. But that's pretty much the drafting process. You just got to win fights.
Create some momentum for yourself.
Create the momentum, and then it's usually you'll reach out to the UFC and try and get on one of those platforms, whether it's the Ultimate Fighter, Contender Series. If you're a really high level fighter, maybe a multiple world champion in a high promotion, then the UFC might approach you. But I think it's more common for you to go and seek those platforms to get on.
All right, so there's no kind of, so to speak, there's no like formal, structured way into getting into the UFC. So there's like, it can just vary from time to time.
Yeah, there's guys that don't deserve to get into the UFC, they get into the UFC, and there's guys that absolutely deserve to be there that will never, for some reason, never get a chance to fight in the UFC. So there's no formal drafting process. It could even come down to who you know, knowing the right manager. A manager's got the gift of the gab, and they can get you on straight onto UFC or straight onto one of these other Contender Series fights.
When you were, I guess, called up by the UFC, how's that process? How does that happen? How does that kind of take place? Do they flick you an email, give you a call, send you a Snapchat? What do? They DM you on Instagram?
I can only speak from my experience from getting to the UFC, which was we sent an email out. We saw that the tryouts were coming to Australia, sent the email out, went up to Sydney, did the tryouts, got into the Ultimate Fighter. I didn't win the Ultimate Fighter, but the UFC, they knew my name. They knew I was young, talented. So I came back to Australia. I needed to have another fight and make a statement. So I called out the middleweight champion. So I went up a weight class, fought the middleweight champ, had a really good fight, beat him. And then I sent the UFC the highlights, said, hey, look, I think I've fixed the things I need to fix from the Ultimate Fighter. And then they said, all right, we'll put you on UFC Auckland. And actually, a funny story. About 3 weeks after the call up to fight in UFC Auckland, I was set to fight Dan Hooker on a main event in Melbourne. So we were paired to fight each other, and then we both happened to get put onto the UFC card in New Zealand. And I went down 1 weight class, he went down 2 weight classes to fight featherweight. But we were 3 weeks away from fighting each other.
Interesting. What year was this?
It would have been. I had my first fight in the UFC 2014. I was 18, so 2012. Yeah, so I was 18-year-old.
Oh, so and
then I got in the UFC when I was 19.
You've been getting knocked about for a few years now. So.
I haven't got knocked about too much, actually. I haven't taken much damage. I've had more concussions playing footy than I've had fighting. I think I had 1 concussion fighting. I had multiple concussions playing football.
Wow.
So when parents used to give my parents a hard time, how do you let your kids do this? I've seen a lot worse injuries in football than in martial arts. I think that's just because we know what to expect. We know we're going there to fight. Your body's prepared for it. Whereas in football, if you get tackled the wrong way or something else happens, you can do
serious damage.
Yeah.
Serious damage. So, take me back to your first fight. I mean, 18, 19. You've gone from, like I said, kicking a drop punt to now you're entering a cage of one of the biggest, let's call it, biggest fighting arenas in the world, most well-known fighting arenas in the world. So you've gone from like kicking a footy on a local oval to like now you're on like
in a few years, yeah.
The world's watching. In other words, right? You come onto this stage and this podium where it's not Dazza and Shazza down at the local footy oval, screaming from the sidelines, half plastered to kick a footy. Now you're kind of sitting in front of these big businessmen and big media outlets. So how does your mindset shift to kind of like, I've gone from a kid that's kicking a footy to like, this is serious now.
I fit straight. My first fight, there was no nerves. Just like most of my other fights, no nerves, no anxiety. It just felt like I was supposed to be there. And because I think it's just the visualization and just just mentally preparing myself, because I knew, despite everyone, when I mean everyone, I mean everyone, even like close family members telling me that it's impossible to get to the UFC, I know get to the UFC, shouldn't give them up footy, should go to uni, should do this, should do that. I was able to block all that out. I've got really resilient mindset, so that none of that ever affected me. I knew what the goal was, I knew what I had to do to get there, and I just stayed on track, stayed on path, no matter what I heard, even from my closest family members. So when I got to my first UFC fight, and I'm talking like the octagon wasn't even legal in Melbourne, so all my fights were in a ring, boxing ring. My first time I ever fought in an octagon was in the UFC. So it's not only, and all the fights were in basketball courts, fighting in tin shed basketball courts in the
full ghetto,
to then the big stadium. So it wasn't even from football to that. It was from the pro level here was such a low level compared to the UFC. Even like that was a big shock. But like I said, it didn't affect me at all. I mean, I just warmed up. Everything was just like clockwork. We were there for fight week. We did the media we had to do, which annoyed me a little bit when I was younger. Now I understand it's part of the job. We have to do it. The media annoyed me. But everything was, we cut weight, went to the fight, we warmed up, and I just felt like I belonged there the whole time. Despite all the naysayers, I felt like I belonged there. I went out there, performed just as good as my fights beforehand, and then it was only until something happened along the way, maybe having kids or starting to get paid really well, there's a lot more on the table. So maybe that sort of holds you back and subconsciously. But back when I was 18, 19, I used to go out there and do what I knew I could do.
It's a lot to kind of it's a lot to take in from a guy who's I'm on the other side of the fence, right? Yeah. So for me, it's quite interesting to see how the narrative shifts, or how the lifestyle shifts rather than a narrative, because footies obviously has its intensity in training and stuff, but MMA training is quite extreme, right? There's so many aspects to becoming an elite fighter. You know, a lot of people, including myself, up until a few years ago, thought, oh, you know, he knows how to do jiu-jitsu, and he can give a really good kick, or you'll knock someone out, and that's the sport. But, you know, I guess how intense is the training? How extreme is the training? How full on can the training become? Like, what's your regime? How, you know, what time do you start? What's your schedule? And what's your mindset really? Because it's in here, isn't it? A lot of it's in here when you kind of wake up in the morning and
every morning,
this is where I need to be. And what do you need to do to get to where you want to be?
It's the training's obviously like very intense. The hardest part of it is, as you said, there's so many aspects and things we have to do to try and balance it all and work every single aspect is very hard. We've got striking, wrestling, jiu-jitsu, strength and conditioning, the recovery sessions you have to fit in, and any other sessions that people do with getting treatment from allied health professionals. Then you got to manage your diet, nutrition. Sometimes I envy like boxers. You know, they might do a bit of fitness in the morning, and they go and hit pads at night, and that's sort of their day. Whereas we have so much we have to fit in. Sometimes you have to understand what kind of style of fighter you are, I guess. See, I'm a very well-rounded fighter. Everything's pretty much on par. I want to maintain that, which means I have to work all those aspects and try and work them evenly as possible. Maybe if you're heading into a fight against a good wrestler, you might work more wrestling for a camp. So things can vary camp to camp, and then you might have fighters like, I'm guessing, Israel Adesanya, Alex Pereira, those high-level strikers. I'm gonna have a guess and say most of their training probably leans towards striking and defensive wrestling. Keep the fight stand up and strike. For me, I like to use my entire arsenal. So I do have good ground game and wrestling, and my striking is good too. So I have to try and balance it all. And that's the hardest part about it. But in terms of the waking up in the morning, I just say to people, I say to young fighters, you know, they talk about, oh, when you get sore, you can't be bothered. I say, put it this way, what do you want out of fighting? Oh, they want to be the best, they want to be a champion. Okay, there's a certain criteria, there's things that you have to do, and they need to be done. There's no leniency on that. There is no leniency. You wake up in the morning, regardless of how your body's feeling, regardless of how you're feeling mentally, you've got 2 or 3 sessions that you have to get up and go to, and they need to be done. And if you don't do them, then you're not going to get to where you want to be. So I look at it in that form. I still love it. I love it just as much as when I was 18, but I look at it as a job. Things need to be done. And I think definitely having kids and other aspects of life help, because subconsciously, like, you don't have to think, I have kids, I need to put food on the table. As a father, it's just something subconsciously where you just get up and you just go. Like, there's been mornings where my partner, she'll have to sit me up in bed because I can't physically sit myself up from back pain or whatever it is, and I'll still go and do the 2 or 3 sessions a day. And then obviously we have our rest days and recovery that we fit in, but when you've got your core sessions that need to be done, I don't know what else to say to these young guys. I say, if you don't want to do them, don't do them. Just don't expect to get to the top level. Yeah. It's as simple as that. And that translates to everything in life. If doesn't matter if it's a business sense or if it's a weight loss goal. Every single day when you wake up, there's things you have to do to reach that goal. And if you don't do them, then you're not going to reach that goal. That's it.
I guess I want to now, dive into Jake as a person. I guess people would want to know day to day, besides the training, besides all the noise and all the media and all the, UFC fighter and traveling and going and fighting and organising fights. I guess Jake as Jake, what's your day to day habits, hobbies? What's life thrown at you?
Everything. We've got a family at home, we've got kids. So if I'm not training or working on, I've got like 4 or 5 side businesses going as well. If I'm not on the laptop working or at the gym training, it's time with the kids. And I've gotten really good recently. There's some things that have helped me do this, but gotten really good recently at making sure the time, we can't get any more time. People say you need to make more time. We can't make more time because, again, there's things we have to do throughout the day and we have to get them done. So you can't really make more time, but the time that you have to make it quality. So if I'm not doing other work, it's quality time with the kids, and that's pretty much my life. You know, every now and then you get a day or half a day to yourself to go do things with your friends, but that's essentially it. But I love it. I could be a multi-millionaire, and I'd still work this hard. I'd never retire. You know, people say, oh, I wish I could retire by the time I'm 30, and I want to be at a point where I could retire, but I know I'll never retire. And that's pretty much it. Like this morning, for example, by the time it was 10:30, 11 in the morning, I was sitting there on the computer, and I was like, I just did more work than the average person probably do in 3 weeks. That's not even an exaggeration. But I love it. I just love being a hustler and just working towards goals. If you don't have that, then I don't know what you've got, to be honest.
Well, yeah, that's the general mentality of MMA fighters, right? It's kind of that they come from a hustling background. Like if you go to a local MMA gym or jiu-jitsu gym or a taekwondo gym that people are aspiring to be a professional fighter, I think a lot of them have that hustler mindset. Like people, you know, a lot of the big fighters in history, when you kind of look at their background, they came from essentially nothing, right? You could say essentially dead broke.
Yep.
Broken families, broken homes, right? Not the wealthiest kid on the block. And I think a lot of the stuff, I guess you notice, you take notice a lot of these things is that a lot of these fighters, a lot of them come from that tough background, or they have that mindset of being a hustler. Now, because I guess that's the kind of DNA in MMA, right? They've got that hustler mindset.
There's something different. You have to have something different.
Yeah.
Up here mentally, there's something. I always say we've got something wrong with us, but I guess it's not really wrong. It's right. We've got something right with us that makes us have that mindset.
Sure. If you could be anything else, or if you wanted to do anything else, what would it be? And you can't say an MMA fighter. Okay,
well, yeah. That's if I honestly had the choice, I would still pick that if I did have the choice. But if that was off the table, I mean, there's been a number of things I wanted to do. If I didn't if I didn't start fighting, I would have joined the military, joined the army. Always wanted to do some sort of special forces. Again, it's pushing the limits, trying to be the best you can be, and just in a different field. You know, I used to race motocross when I was younger. I wanted to be a motocross racer at one point. Used to race mini GP. So, you know, we would love to be like a MotoGP racer. Tried my hand at pretty much everything. Used to swim when I was younger, do triathlons. So I would imagine it'd be some sort of other sport, some sort of other athlete. I think I'm very drawn towards sports. But if it come to some other line of work, it probably would have joined the army. And technically still in the army as a part-time. So I joined the army, did reserves, did all that. Just, again, something to keep me busy, something outside of fighting. Just like all the businesses I run, it was just something to add, to just keep me busy and just keep working towards. Just more goals to work towards, I guess. That's like a mental break. So when I talk about recovery, mental recovery is the biggest thing for me. So, and all these things I do on the side, people say, oh, but you're not resting, you're working, you're still working. I said, yeah, but it's the mental recovery that I need. The last thing I want to do is train 6 days a week. All my friends are fighters. All we do is talk about fighting. At night time, I'm coaching fighters. The last thing I do on a Sunday is go and watch UFC. You know, if it's a big fight, I'll watch it, but I need to do something else. Or those times that I have a break throughout the day, I need to do something else. And that was just joining the army was just one of those things, something else to preoccupy my mind. And it actually, doing these things makes me realize how lucky I am. You know, I'm sitting on the laptop for 3-4 hours having to do work. You get a sense of what it's like in the real world. And it makes you grateful and makes you feel lucky to be able to do what we do in the cage. So in a way, if I was just fighting and just training every day, I'd imagine you get very complacent. I've seen guys that all they do is train and fight, and they are complacent. You know, I'm tired. You know, it's hard. But getting that perspective of having the other businesses to run, seeing the other side of what life's like, it just keeps me. It's like I'm almost playing mental games with myself. I do love it, but it's almost like tricking myself mentally into getting that perspective to say I'm lucky. And every day I wake up, I don't think in the last 10 years of being in the UFC, I've woken up one day and thought, I don't want to do this anymore. Every day I wake up, it's just, the first thing is, I'm breathing. That's the first thing. I'm lucky. My legs work, arms work. What do I have to complain about? And then on top of that, you know, being able to fight in the UFC, being able to go and train 2-3 times a day. There's people, there's people in the world. Again, something I say all the time. There's people in the world that, for whatever reason, disability, money reasons, they can't train. They probably never will train in their life, and they want to, but they can't. I get to go and do it for a living. So yeah, it's just all perspective for me, and doing all those side things helps with that.
What are we gonna see from Jake in the next 12 months? What's running through Jake's mind at the moment of what's he looking for in the next 12 months, or what's he set out to achieve in the next 12 months?
First thing that comes to mind is the 5-fight plan. So we sat down with the team. We changed things. So 2 fights ago when I fought in Singapore, obviously had a breakthrough performance. First time in 10 years, or 9 years in the UFC, but first time where I fought, you know, I showed part of my potential. And that's just 10 years of trial and error. You know, your performance in the cage comes down to your training camp, who you have around you, who you take to fight week, what you're doing during fight week, what you're doing before the fight. There's a number of things that contribute. So we must have dialed in on what we need to do. We've got the equation right for that fight. Last fight, we dropped the ball a little bit, and that just come down to it was just simply game planning. But win, lose, or draw, we've got a plan of 5 fights, and from Singapore. So now we've just had the second fight. So by the time we have the next 3 fights, we'll have everything completely dialed in, and then it's just upward from there. So whatever happens over the next 5 fights, by the time those 5 fights are done, we'll know what we need to do to get to the top, and then we start pushing. You know, top 15, top 10, top 5, and we just keep climbing. It's not like chasing a world title or a belt. My main goal was to put food on the table, support the family. If that's your primary goal, then a title should come along with that, because nothing should be more important than that. So that's the mindset I've got. So just, yeah, the 5-fight plan, keep putting food on the table, supporting the family, and then along with that, if a title comes, then that's just a bonus on top.
It's good to get a perspective from your end that obviously family is very important to you, and then obviously they're a key driving factor in you doing what you do. I guess what I'm trying to get to as well is when's your next fight? Have you thought about that, or are you kind of at the moment just pulling back, or you've got a different strategy, or are we going to see Jake in a cage anytime soon, or is Jake just holding back, resting a bit?
No rest.
No rest.
No, it's we want to keep the momentum up, but it depends on the division, the state of the division, whether guys want to fight you or not. You know, after the last fight in Singapore, we were trying to call for a top 15 guy. None of them were biting, so sometimes you can't help but sort of sit on the sideline, and then. You know, the other option is we just take any fight they give us, which could be risky considering coming off that momentum. You want to try and get a good fight. But I ideally want to have 3 to 4 fights a year, which is very achievable. You know, if I fight before June this year, that'll be 3 in the last 12 months. That's ideal. That's what we want. So definitely trying to stay active, and you know, with all the COVID lockdowns, and I've had dual hip surgery back 2017, so that was about 9 or 10 months layoff. So I've had a few stints of layoffs, especially after COVID. We just want to keep the ball rolling and stay active. And you know, since the lockdowns had finished, we've got about 3 or 4 fights in, and we just want to keep the momentum going. So obviously we want to take smart fights that are going to help me propel to the top as quick as possible. We feel like we're at that age where we're hitting that peak age. Everyone says, you know, you peak in your late 20s, early 30s. We feel not only I'm at that age now, but we actually can see that in training and feel it in the fights. So that's the goal. 3 fights a year, and it's always been fight by fight. I never look past the fight. I never say I want this opponent after this fight. The times I've done that are the times that I've lost. So that fight, that's the last day I'm fighting. After that fight, there's nothing else beyond it. I might as well in my mind, I might as well put the gloves down in the octagon, hang it up, and stop fighting, because there's nothing past it. And when I do that, then all my attention and focus is just solely on that fight. Other fighters might be different. Maybe the prospect of them fighting, you know, 2 or 3 fights down the track, who they're going to fight, that excites them and gives them motivation. But for me, I need to just focus solely on the one fight that's coming up.
If you even answer, like, what was your favourite fight, or what was your most enjoyable time
I've competed in?
That you've competed in?
It would have to be. There's 2 that stand out. One was against Li Jingliang. That was in Perth, and for the reason where I just wanted to show my striking ability. So I started boxing from about 12 for football and took to it really well. And most of my sparring from 18 to 22 was all boxing sparring. And I still have boxing brass, you know, high-level coaches and boxing brass. They see me today and they say, you should hang the MMA gloves up and box. They still say it today from how good I used to box and still do box. So all my fights are very grapple heavy. And as soon as you put the small gloves on, striking is different. So I was starting getting frustrated and I said, I'm just going to comment on Instagram and say, this fight, I'm going to knock him out or get knocked out. And in my mind, once I say it, I've said it. I'm not going to be a liar. So I put it out there without telling any of my team or anything. I just put it out there, and I said, I've said it now, so I have to do it. So we went out, and it was just an absolute war. We got fight of the night. It's famous because I got eye gouged, one of the most brutal eye gouges in the UFC. Still suffer, actually. That eye's sort of deteriorated quite a bit, but yeah, just the way the fight went was good. We did mix in wrestling when we needed to, but it was a heavy striking match, dug deep, and it was probably one of the hardest fights to date that I had, and really showed that I had that, you know, grit, determination, and the heart in the fights as well. So that's a standout fight for me. And then obviously the fight in Singapore, got the big knockout, just a boxing clinic, I guess, and that was a fight. Not just for the fight, but also the lead up. Like I said, we dialed in on everything. Even the fight week was just, we had the right people around us. It was really enjoyable, and we put it together on the night. And my team could tell. They could tell with the last fight that I wasn't quite switched on, and they could tell for the Singapore fight that I was 100% switched on from how we were warming up. So based on that, we would go back and look at what we did and try to apply that. So the lessons we learned in that Singapore fight, and the way everything went from the fight camp to the fight week to the actual fight itself, that's probably the biggest standout fight for me, as well as the one against Jing Liang.
So you've mentioned obviously that you've had other factors contribute now in your life in terms of, you know, being more aware of your family, your kids, and your surroundings. What is that? Like, obviously we've spoken about Jake's physical presence, the mental aspect, but then you've obviously mentioned now that you've had other things come into your life that's assisted you in being more aware of what's important in your life. So what exactly is that? What's kind of brought on this different change or different aspect to life?
Yeah, religion's been a big part. So for those that don't know, I'm Muslim, and man, I don't know where to start with the story. I think you see it a lot with high level athletes. You know, finding God and finding religion. I think we reach a certain point where it's not enough. The things around us are not enough to motivate us and keep us on the right path and keep us disciplined. There needs to be something else. And for me, it was like guidelines on, you know, ethics and morality and obviously, you know, so I started, you know, obviously believing that there's something else out there. And man, the story of how I became Muslim, it's probably a shock to some people, but and to others it's not. But it come down to a podcast. So I'll tell a story quick. We have acreage, so I was mowing the lawn one day, and I need to have a podcast that goes for about 6 hours, because that's how long it takes to mow the lawn. So I put up history of Christianity.
It's a big lawn, man.
5 acres, yeah. You know, with coffee breaks and going to the shop.
Is that like a zero turn or a right on?
Zero turn. It's a monster. It's huge.
It still takes you that long?
Yeah, there's like fences and trees, and it's a bit fiddly, but yeah. So I put on the history of Christianity, and I listened to it, and you know, I already knew, you know, part of the history of Christianity, but I was never baptized when I was born. Never really pushed towards a certain religion. And then the next time, so months down the track, I mow it again, and I was like, I need another podcast. So I was like, I'll listen to the history of Islam, different religion. completely separate, it's something new. I put it on and I was like, hold on a second. I'm like, this is not separate. And it just completely, the first thing I thought is like all the conflicts and wars over the years for something where it's very similar to Christianity. And then from there, it just sparked my interest, the history side of things. So I already knew a bit about Christianity, so I started really looking into Islam and the history of it, all the history of the prophets, and then found out that it's not just, the religion is very much like guidelines on how to live ethically, morally, and it clicked with me because it's things that I feel that I needed to take me to the next level. You know, when you're having days where you're not feeling quite, disciplined, it helps, especially Islam. You know, we've got 5 prayers a day we have to stick to. There's things you wake up in the morning, there's things you have to do. You have to do these things. And it fits exactly into my mindset with business, with my athletic career. And from there, it just progressed. I just kept learning. And when people ask me when it happened, officially, like towards the start of the year, unofficially, I was like a closet Muslim for like a year and a half. That's what I tell people, because I adopted the lifestyle back then. And people will probably think, oh, you know someone who's influenced a certain way. None of my friends knew. Like my best friend didn't know until about 5 weeks before we made it official. And the reason was I didn't want to have anyone try and steer me a certain way. I wanted to do it on my own. So I'd always ask people questions, but I never told them my intentions. I'd ask them as if I was just interested in the history of it, and I'd ask them questions. But people always ask, because we'd go out and eat, and I'd make sure I'm obviously not eating pork, and they'd be like, oh, that's a Muslim thing, you're Muslim? I was like, oh, no, just, I didn't tell anyone my intentions. There's only a few close to me that sort of knew my intentions, and then it got to a point where I wanted to make sure it's not a phase, it's not a fad.
Yeah, sure. And
a year and a half later, I'm still just as passionate and just as committed to it. So I was like, okay, this is real now. This is real, so ready to take the next step. And it's made a massive difference. Just never been happier before. Everything I explained with the kids about the quality time, that all comes down to me becoming Muslim and applying, as much as I know, applying those guidelines to my life. And even my partner, she's not Muslim, one day inshallah, but she said never change back to what I was. She said the difference is just night and day. The amount of effort I put in, making sure the time's quality with the family, even just doing things around the house. It's just, you see something that needs to be done, and it's just something inside me now says, like, whether it's like feeding the dog in the morning or feeding him when I get back home. Like I'm in a rush, sometimes you leave and just be, I'll feed him later. There's something inside me now says, like, you've got to do it. I could be late to whatever I'm heading to, but there's things that need to be done, I have to do them. And that sort of discipline has translated to everything, to the business side of things, to the athletic career, and it's made a massive difference. And I think even the people that don't know of me being Muslim, they can see the difference.
Sure. The way that the world's degenerated, especially over the last 60 years.
That's also a big reason why I was like, everyone needs to believe in something. The way the world's going at the moment, you have to have something you believe in.
Yeah. Islam provides this holistic solution for the world, right? It's a holistic solution. It solves the world's problems. That's what it does, right? And Allah created mankind. He created me, he created you. And it's like someone, you've got a Holden, right? That Holden's got a manual. You take that manual to a Skoda or a Volkswagen or a Renault dealer, and he's going to go through that manual. He's not going to know the ins and outs and the crux of that car as compared to you take it to the Holden dealer, because they manufactured that. They know the car in and out, right? That's the manual book for that car. So as humans, Allah sent us with these books, and He sent us with the Quran, and that's the manual on how this human functions optimally, holistically, completely, right? From a socioeconomic perspective, from a business perspective, from a traveling perspective, from a family perspective, from a business perspective, from the whole thing, right? So Islam actually has rules and regulations for every single aspect of your life, right? When you're in business, it's got rules.
That's what I liked
right?
about it, was how to interact with your family, how to approach conflict with your spouse, how to deal with business. You know what I mean? Like, you should be approaching business. You shouldn't be trying to rip anyone off. There's so many things that you learn and apply to your real life. That's what big thing that drew me to it as well, for sure.
So they're the sort of aspects. So, I mean, this is such a huge topic, right? And there's obviously more qualified people than me and more well-versed people than me, right? But this is just something that, we skim on this topic, and just to kind of cover, because you kind of obviously brought up, you became Muslim and stuff. So it's just something to see how and why and all these things. But it's a very large topic and something that can be discussed for hours, and people do discuss this for hours. I think people learned a fair bit tonight from Jake. I certainly did. I obviously had a lot of questions coming in tonight. Put all the cameras and stuff and all the boys behind the cameras now. I had my own questions in my head because, like I said, I never understood how a person goes from, an amateur fighter, to kind of hitting the big stage in the UFC. And then also I didn't know how you kind of progress from there. Like, how does the ranking work? How do you, how many fights do you have to win to go to this level? So obviously a lot of those questions were answered for me tonight, and I'd like to thank you for coming past tonight.
I only just scratched the surface, really.
I know, time's so limited. I know you got your own schedule and stuff, but definitely would love to have you back in the future.
Absolutely.
And get some of the other boys around the table and have a more of a athlete's chat, as opposed to a guy like me who's a bit ignorant in certain aspects of sport. It'd
be good to compare to some other. I know a lot of other athletes from across other sports, and it's always good to compare, and not only compare, but see where we have similarities and can compare things as well.
Awesome. Jake, you're a legend. Thank you so much, brother.
Thank you very much.
We'll see you next time. Thanks for tuning into our first episode of our Gorilla podcast. This is what you could be expecting moving down in the future. We'll have some more guest speakers and athletes from different kind of sports, different Gorilla athletes as well. Have a few panel discussions with Jake and a few of the other athletes, and thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you guys next time.